So a quick overview, this is what's highlighted in the agenda, which everyone should have received. We're going to hear some welcoming remarks from some of the key partners who put today together. We're going to have a couple of great presentations about stewardship, issues for rural landowners, and then we're going to take a break. After we come back from the break, we've got a couple more presentations. We're going to round it out with a landowner panel, hear firsthand from a couple of landowners who have been through some of these processes like conservation easements. And then we're going to get y'all to lunch and out for the weekend at 12 o'clock. So a lot of great information packaged into 3 solid, jam-packed hours. I would be remiss if I didn't thank our sponsors who made today possible. We've got the Gillespie County AgriLife Extension, the Alamo Resource Conservation and Development Area, Texas A&M's Natural Resources Institute, the Fredericksburg chapter of the Native Plant Society of Texas, Braun and Gresham, Plateau Land and Wildlife Management, and James D. Bradbury. So thank you all for your support and helping make today possible. Now we're going to transition over to a couple of welcoming remarks from the key partners. I'm going to kick us off, assuming my computer, there we go. So again, my name is Daniel Oppenheimer. I'm the Land Program Manager at the Hill Country Alliance. We are a regional nonprofit organization that works throughout the Central Texas Hill Country to conserve the things that make this a beautiful place we know and love. We work on issues related to land, water, night skies in our communities, and a lot of our work is done through education and outreach, and then bringing partners together to collaborate and bolster our impacts across the Hill Country. I'm next going to introduce Brad Rader from Gillespie County AgriLife. Brad, would you like to say a quick hello and tell folks how you can be a resource for them?
Good deal, Daniel. Yes, Brad Rader here with the, I'm with the Gillespie County AgriLife Extension Office, but we have a county office in almost every county in the state. So for those of you who are not from Gillespie County, you can look that up. Online is probably the best way to do it. Just type in your county name and AgriLife, and it'll usually be one of the first things that pops up. We are funded through county, state, and federal dollars. We're kind of a partnership between all 3. And if I'm going to run down a list of things we cover, and you'll see we're very diverse. And that's what I like to tell people. We're kind of a clearinghouse for agriculture questions. We have agents in every county. A lot of them, like in this county, in Gillespie County, we have 4 agents, and I'll run through a little bit of what they do. And then we also have a whole host of course, professors and specialists across the state that specialize in different areas, everything from farming to range to ag to wellness and just a whole host of things. So I kind of like to consider us kind of a clearinghouse. If you don't know where to go with the ag question, just give us a shout, and we may not be able to answer all your questions, but we can probably find a producer or a specialist or another agent who as well has a lot of expertise in that area. Just wanted to start off, since we're doing a landowner meeting, we do have a large part in wildlife. We work very close with some of the other participants on this call, but we manage in Gillespie County, we manage the wildlife management areas, and they are mainly for deer hunting and hunting leases, but we have about 400 landowners that are part of those. They come together and talk about issues with hunting and management of white-tailed deer mainly, and just generating some income off of that land to help improve the land as they go along. One of the other big deals those wildlife associations do is they put on youth hunts every year for about 100, typically urban kids who've never got to hunt before. So that's a really neat deal they do. We also have a hort agent there in the office in Gillespie County, and she probably covers some other counties just because a lot of counties don't have hort agents. They do gardens, lawns, orchards, can come out, do site visits as we do on just about anything. So if you've got a problem with one of those or looking at putting in an orchard or maybe a garden, she's a good reference there to start with. Then we have FCS agents typically in every county, and they work really on healthy living and lifestyle, family issues, and we have Shay Nebgen there. She's probably one of the best FCS agents in the state. And one of her big pushes right now is working with the youth on our Texas Youth Healthy Texan Youth Ambassador program, where she has kids that go into schools and give programs on everything from vaping to bullying, and so does a really good job there. As we talk about youth, I would be remiss, AgriLife and Extension, probably our flagship program is our youth program. We learned a long time ago, back in the early 1900s, that you can train youth a lot more than you can train maybe some of the old Germans that live in the community on how to do things a little better. And so we have a huge 4-H program in our county, as we do here in District 10, which covers most of the Hill Country, everything from range to livestock to like I said, the Healthy Texas Youth Ambassadors, to food, nutrition, horticulture, gardening. We have 450 kids in our county right now enrolled in 4-H. And they learn a lot about ag, and we try to teach that along with the FFA advisors in the area, really work with the youth. So again, on the ag side, I'm here. I have a lot of expertise in sheep and goats, managing hunting, things like that, some of the exotic industry. Also just general grazing questions. Get a lot of calls in our office on fences and laws. So, I've done a lot of research on that and picked Miss Tiffany's brain quite a bit. But if you just got a general ag question, you don't know where to go, feel free to give us a call here at the Gillespie County Extension Office, and we can shoot you in the right direction. Thank you, Daniel.
Brad, we got a question. Tell us a little bit about Beth. Someone wanted to know, who's your horticulture person?
I got you. Miss Beth McMahon, sorry, didn't mention her name, but Beth McMahon, she grew up right here in Harper, Texas. She went off and got her master's in horticulture, worked down around the Houston area for a while, and Beth is always out, very, very good to work with, and has a lot of expertise in lawns, gardens, and orchards.
Thanks, Brad. All right, well, I'm going to move us on to our next co-host, and that's Tiffany with the Hill Country Land Trust. And Tiffany, I believe you're on mute.
Yep, I sure was. All right, thanks, Daniel, and hi, everybody. I'm picturing all of us with fuzzy bunny slippers right now. I wanted to say a little bit about the Hill Country Land Trust. So we serve a 19-county area of the Texas Hill Country, and we've got 3 priority conservation areas that we've focused on over the last 20 or so years. Those include the Pedernales River Basin, the Balcones Canyonlands area, and the viewshed of Enchanted Rock. And while we've had some successes in those areas, the development pressure there is only increasing, and we're continuing to see larger historic ranch tracts cut into smaller and smaller pieces for development. And of course, that is affecting wildlife habitat, scenic open space, and the quality and quantity of our water resources, among other things. Last year, Hill Country Land Trust celebrated our 20th anniversary. And in that time, we've preserved over 8,000 acres in 21 conservation easements in partnership with our private landowners. So our conservation successes haven't actually slowed down, but in recent years, the demand and interest in conservation easements has increased and has actually expanded beyond the capacity of our current board. So very recently, we've decided that it's time to pass the torch of Hill Country land conservation to the Texas Land Conservancy. And we'll hear from them in just a minute. TLC is an organization with greater capacity, a long history, and a really bright future. So we're super proud that HCLT's legacy and our conservation promise to the Hill Country will live on through the work of TLC, and we're happy to have them here as a partner today so that you can all hear a little bit from them, and all of our topics today will be relevant towards both of our organizations' work. And we're happy to be moving forward. We're going to be transferring all of our conservation easement projects to TLC, who will have a greater presence here in the Hill Country. And we'll also be encouraging interested landowners, and some of you may be on this call, to contact the Stellar organization to help preserve their slice of the Hill Country. So with that little bit of news, I'd like to thank you, Daniel and Mark, and all of our sponsors. And I know we're all looking forward to hearing from our excellent panel of speakers today.
Thanks, Tiffany. All right, so next I'd like to introduce Mark with the Texas Land Conservancy.
Thanks, Daniel. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Steinbach. I'm the Executive Director of the Texas Land Conservancy. We are a statewide organization, so we've been in operation almost 40 years. We have a primary focus on the Hill Country watershed basins, and then out in East Texas, we do a lot of work as well. And so this kind of marriage that Tiffany was talking about was an obvious fit for us to pick up the ball and run with it when they decided to do that. We're really excited about this opportunity. And we'll continue work that we already have a pretty healthy portfolio of Hill Country projects as well. And you'll hear from one of our landowners out here in the area as well later today. So I'm really looking forward to this. Happy to answer questions. Daniel's put my contact information up here. So thanks for doing this, and thanks, Daniel.
All right. Thanks, y'all, and thanks for helping organize and make today possible. So with that, I'd like to introduce our very first speaker of the day, Steve Nelle. I am really lucky. I get to work with a bunch of smart landowners and a bunch of great partners and different agencies and nonprofits. And there are few folks who are so revered for their knowledge of the land and the manner in which they approach stewardship. And so we're really lucky to get to have Steve Nelle with us this morning to talk a little about land stewardship, what that even means, and how we can be good stewards of the land. So with that, Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Very good to be here with everyone this morning. I'm going to get these slides up, hopefully. And Daniel, would you reply back if the volume and everything is okay?
I can see your PowerPoint, and I can hear you loud and clear, Steve.
Very good. We're going to go ahead and start, as Daniel said, with a discussion of land stewardship. What is it? Why is it important? I want to start off, however, by talking about a very common misperception when it comes to land stewardship. Many people would say that land stewardship is simply synonymous with the practices that are carried out on the land, whether that be brush control, rotational grazing, prescribed fire, or any other of the practices. And while these practices are certainly related to land stewardship, we want to say and emphasize that land stewardship is not merely a listing, a checklist of practices that is carried out on the land. Rather, land stewardship at its core is about the relationship between a person and a piece of land. When land stewardship is being carried out, there's going to be several things that are obvious and true, some byproducts of land stewardship. And one of those is healthy soil, or at least soil health moving in the right direction. So healthy soil, a functioning water cycle is another byproduct of land stewardship. We know how important that is to everyone. Land stewardship produces good wildlife habitat. And we're not just talking about the species we hunt, although that is important, but we're talking about habitat for many species, a byproduct of land stewardship. And we can say that land stewardship provides the basis and the foundation for productive and profitable agriculture. Most of us don't like to go very long between meals, and it's easy to see that agriculture is pretty darn important to us and to our society. And we want agriculture to be profitable, because that's how people stay connected to the land and able to invest back into the land. So the economic part is very important. And if agriculture feeds our bellies, natural beauty feeds our souls, and both are important. And stewardship lands will have aesthetic beauty. We can also say that land stewardship benefits all Texans. Every citizen of our state, no matter where they live, in the city or in the country, benefits when land is well taken care of. And that's a message that we all need to probably do a better job of proclaiming, of how important this is to every man, woman, and child in Texas. So what does land stewardship look like? Well, perhaps it looks something like this: a close connection to the land and a connection to the future. So I hope you would agree with me that land stewardship must be and is the very backbone for sustaining the natural resources and the natural values of Texas. We can learn a lot about stewardship from these two gentlemen. Most of you probably know who Aldo Leopold is. You may or may not know who Chip Merrill is. In my book, he's Mr. Land Stewardship. For about 30 years, he was the director of the TCU Ranch Management Program, one of my mentors. But let's see what these two gentlemen have to say about man's relationship to the land. Leopold said, "It is inconceivable to me that an ethical relation to the land can exist without love, respect, and admiration for the land, and a high regard for its value." And here's what Chip Merrill says: "One cannot work closely with the land for very long without developing a deep respect and appreciation for its character and its capabilities." So from these two gentlemen, these two excerpts, we can learn what this stewardship relation to the land consists of. It consists of having a deep respect for the land, an appreciation for the land, the realization that land has character and it has capability, that one can have an ethical relationship to the land, that one can and should love the land, admire the land, and have a high regard for the land, not just what it will produce, but for the land itself. So I think you can see that land stewardship is really about who a person is on the inside. So I'd like to propose this as perhaps a definition of land stewardship: being a deeply held inner conviction that motivates landowners and land managers to care for and sustain the land that has been entrusted to them. And why do they do it? For their own personal benefit? Yes, that is part of it. For the benefit of future generations? Yes, that's also involved. But also for the benefits that accrue to society. And this is perhaps what sets apart the genuine land steward, this recognition that there's a great deal of benevolence involved in land stewardship. It helps other people. Here's how one ranch describes their stewardship ethics and beliefs. They say, "We realize that the decisions we make on this ranch have a rippling effect." In other words, they're acknowledging that what they do affects other people outside their fence. "Our goal is to improve the ecological health of the land while at the same time making a living for ourselves." And so what more can society ask for than landowners who have that kind of ethic? Leopold said that a land ethic reflects the existence of an ecological conscience and a conviction of individual responsibility for the health of the land. Now, the word stewardship is not found there, but this is what stewardship is all about a person having a tender conscience toward the land and having inner convictions about taking care of the land. And so no matter if the landowner looks kind of crusty and gruff on the outside, the steward is going to have a tender heart toward the land, and his convictions about the land are not going to allow him to do anything to degrade or damage the land. over the last 44 years of working with landowners, these are some of the things that I have found to be generally true as a way of describing that genuine land steward. They are people of great knowledge. It's not just book knowledge, it's not just seminar knowledge, it's practical day-to-day knowledge of soil, water, plants, animals, and how all these things work together under human management. And so this knowledge is able to be translated into concrete skills and ability to manage and take care of the land. Land stewards are highly committed people. It's not a part-time deal. It's not a pastime. It's a full-time commitment to a piece of land and everything that involves. They are people of perseverance because they know that there will be setbacks when you're working with nature. It's inevitable, and you have to be able to get past those hardships and setbacks. Land stewards are people who invest themselves into a piece of land. They invest their families into their work, and their soul and everything about them is invested into a piece of land. They strive to see the big picture. It's not just about raising cattle or raising deer or lots of songbirds or lots of wildflowers. Those things may be important, but they strive to see the bigger picture of landscape health, and the water cycle especially would be a part of that. They have to be realistic. When you're working with the land, you don't call the shots. The land, nature calls the shots more than anything, and you do not force the land to do what it cannot do. So you understand the limitations and the capabilities of every piece of land. And in general, land stewards try to have that long-term perspective. It's not only about what you do today or tomorrow. It's about 5, 10, 15, 20 years, the next generation, and the next generation after that. So these things are generally true of this person that we call a genuine land steward. That old man standing on the right-hand bank of the Blanco River, you see him, he's getting pretty old. He knows he's not going to be around much longer. He's thinking, he's contemplating, will my children and grandchildren take care of this ranch the way I have taken care of it? Will they love this piece of land the way I have loved it? That's what old people think about. And so part of stewardship is the stewardship of the future. It's that legacy of what's going to be left behind after you're gone, and making those assurances while you're still alive that those things will continue after you're gone and the next generation take over. Many families across this country, across Texas, and across the Hill Country are thinking about those things. How do we keep this piece of land intact? How do we keep it in operation? And these are things that families think about and consider. And many of them are considering the values of conservation easements. They're curious about, is this for me? Will it help me and my family achieve what we want to do? But it's not just about men and boys in straw hats. It's just as much about a grandmother teaching her granddaughter about flowers, about butterflies, about the birds. And so that little girl will one day love that piece of land so much that she's going to want to preserve Grandpa's old farm from ever being divided or developed or abused in any way. So it's not just about the agricultural facets, it's about everyone who loves and cares for a piece of land. I'm a person who enjoys going back in time and thinking about the way things were a long time ago. This is the schoolhouse that my grandma and her 2 sisters attended near the town of Sisterdale. Sometimes I like to go back into the past and think about how it was 100 years ago. But we can't do that, can we? We know that the Hill Country was much different 100 years ago, but we can't go back. We're stuck in the future, and the things that we do now, or we're stuck in the present, and the things we do affect what happens in the future. And we see the hill country being chipped away little by little. We don't have to look very far to see what's happening to the hill country. It's not like it was 50 or 100 years ago. It's different. And these things are disturbing to a lot of people who want to see what's left of the hill country be maintained. It has been said that those who do not understand nature are destined to deplete it. And I have found that to be a true statement. And there's many ways that nature can be depleted, and we see examples of it in the hill country. So that's the bad news. But the good news, and the corollary to this truth, is that those who understand nature best are compelled to conserve it. And I believe that's true, that when people understand nature better, they are more motivated to care for it and conserve it and take good care of it. Many years ago, I thought I knew the answer to this question. What would be required to retain what is left and what is special about the hill country? And I thought it was these 5 items: that we need large tracts of land in predominantly native vegetation under private ownership, operated under the principles of good stewardship, and in a way that is economically sustainable. I thought that was the answer to saving the hill country. And these things are important, but I was missing one important element that I've come to appreciate in recent years, and that these things must be today, and they must be tomorrow, and they must happen forever. To conserve, to protect, and to sustain in perpetuity. That is what land trust organizations are all about, and the people who support that. And you're going to learn more about that today. So stay on for the rest of the workshop for sure. From my perspective, the role of land trusts and associated organizations, yes, they do help landowners with conservation easements, very important part of the equation. Involved in education and outreach, that is where Hill Country Alliance shines very bright. We all need to be involved in that, but also finding ways to inspire and motivate this genuine land stewardship, because most of the time, the land stewardship must precede the conservation easement. And so you and I, everyone who's tuned in here, needs to be doing everything we can in the way of education, outreach, bringing people together. And I've been very gratified in recent years to see and experience landowners coming together, oftentimes on their own, sometimes formally, sometimes informally, to consider the land and the big picture of land health and stewardship. And so I think this is a good trend that we see happening across the region. And anything that we can do in every one of us in our sphere of influence, where we can help people deepen and strengthen that connection to the land, that's going to be important as far as instilling and motivating these genuine land stewardship ethics. And the results of all of this are good for everyone. Clean water, sustained flows over time, sustainable agriculture, fish and wildlife habitat, natural beauty, aesthetic values, recreation, and all of these things now and forever. That's what we're striving for. These are the results of stewardship. And you're going to hear people in the remainder of this workshop describe how that can happen.
All right, Steve, thank you so much. Folks, as Steve said, he's been doing this for almost 45 years, and there's a great spot where his knowledge has been captured. If you go to hillcountrylandtrust.org, again, that's hillcountrylandtrust.org, look for their video series. They put together a top-notch video series featuring Steve Nelle on a variety of land stewardship topics. There's also, underneath each of those videos, there's usually a link to a PDF guide that provides additional content. And so I shared with each of you just one of the examples, which was how to read the land. But really, I can't emphasize enough, go to that website, check out the videos, check out the resources that are embedded underneath each video, share them with your family. It's a remarkable resource. So Steve, thank you. All right, well, thanks everybody. We are going to transition over to our second presenter, Jim Bradbury, who's going to be talking about key issues for rural landowners and ranchers. Jim is an attorney with his own practice where he focuses on business disputes, real estate, environmental litigation, and eminent domain matters. He's also an adjunct professor of Texas A&M Law School. And the first time I met Jim, he saved my shade structure from being blown into the Pedernales River. So Jim, thank you for joining us today. If you'd like to share your screen, the floor is yours.
All right, let me see if I can get that done. Good morning to everybody. Can you see that, Daniel? Does that look good?
It looks beautiful.
All right, well, good. Happy Friday to everybody. It's really nice to be with you. And boy, that was fantastic, Steve. I really wish every Friday morning in my life began with a presentation like that. That was really good. So happy to follow you. You know, for those of you who are on and joining us today, I'll just offer a few comments before I get into the substance. But I mean, as Daniel mentioned, I practice in several areas, but without question of all the things that I do, this particular topic and transaction is my absolute favorite. I mean, you are stepping this morning into a tremendous world of really, really great people like Steve, Daniel, Tiffany, Mark, and others. There's a fantastic community that's been alive for a while in Texas, conserving the great places in Texas, but it's really growing. In the last 7 or 8 years, I've seen a real increase in interest of Texas landowners as we see cities growing out, fragmentation, and loss of special places. More and more people are becoming interested in this conservation easement tool, like Steve's image of the older man on the edge of the river contemplating. You know, all of us in a lot of ways in Texas are that man standing on the edge of something, thinking about what's going to be left in 10, 15, 20, or 50 years. And this tool that I'm going to give you some of the, you know, the high points this morning is really the only tool that we have in the law in Texas to ensure that these great places in Texas and the piece of land that you own will remain as it is today permanently. And, you know, if you think about it, you can't do that by your will. You can't do it by making your kids promise. There's nothing else that will do it like this particular tool. So let me start walking through this. And, you know, you heard that phrase from Steve, a conservation easement. That's what we're going to talk about. And I'll tell you, if this is the first time you've heard this or you don't really know what that term means, don't worry. But also I'll give you a tip here, because I've done this a few times. Don't try to understand everything. Don't be paralyzed by this. Some of it's going to be a little legal. The idea is to give you just enough information to intrigue you to take a step further. These are transactions that don't happen overnight. You just don't run down to the land trust or to the lawyer's office and pop in and say, I'd like to do a conservation easement next week. It's something that takes time because it is a permanent decision. It's something that has to be very balanced and very delicate in regards to how permanent it is. So just take a few pieces of what I'm saying, and if hopefully if I intrigue enough of you with it, you can reach out to either the land trust here today or do a little reading on your own. And I'm happy as I walk through this, if there are questions about what I'm talking about, put them in the chat box, and then Tiffany or Daniel will throw them at me, and we can talk about them while we're moving through this. First off, what is a conservation easement? And let me walk through this definition. That it's a voluntary legal agreement between a landowner and a qualified holder. And I'm going to take this in pieces because this one definition probably does more to explain and dispel myths about conservation easements than anything else. But it's voluntary. This is not something the government comes in and imposes, or a land trust or any other group. It is 100% the landowner's decision whether this is something that's a good fit for you, and eventually if it progresses to the point that you are comfortable with all the consequences and dimensions of this, you would then sign this conservation easement, which would be recorded at the courthouse. But I just want to underscore this because I typically get a question to say, well, is the government involved? Is this going to be enforced? And it's absolutely not. It's a decision for you and your family to make. Next part of the definition, that allows the landowner to permanently limit the type or amount of development on the property. And that's a key piece of a conservation easement, is that, when it's drafted and about to be signed, what you're going to see in there are very specific prohibitions against certain activities on the property. The obvious one is commercial development. There's not going to be any Walmarts, no parking lots, no condominiums, none of that type of stuff. And this document is what precludes it forever. Once it is put in place, no one, no matter how smart their lawyers are, how much money they have, is going to be able to take that property and develop it. Moving on to the next part of the definition, in order to protect the property's conservation and ag values. The other piece of that conservation easement would be very extensive. It's going to talk about the nature of the property, the water features on the property, the grasses, great detail, because there is no one conservation easement. A lot of times I'll have landowners and say, hey, Jim, send me the conservation easement, as though there are just one. But every conservation easement is different because it has to be tailored to your particular piece of property. And it's going to go to great lengths to say, look, here are the elements of my property that we are going to conserve permanently, and then more details about how we're going to do that. Likewise, it preserves ag values. This is a tool that is very dear to agriculture, because once you put one of these in place, it really is not going to impair any of your current ag uses, whether you're raising livestock, whether you have a wildlife exemption and you're using it for deer hunting or simply bird watching. Any of those aspects are going to be permanently preserved. Last piece of this definition is while retaining private ownership of the land. And that's maybe the most important, because I have a lot of people say, well, if I don't want to sell my property, I don't want to give it up. Well, let me explain this. When you give the conservation easements, you're going to be conveying certain rights to the land trust, and the land trust then is going to become a partner with you regarding the continued enforcement of the terms of that conservation easement, to ensure forever after you're gone that the terms of that conservation easement are going to be kept in force. But you continue to own the property. You will be the record owner of your property, and you're free to sell it to somebody else or pass it on to your children. But you're not giving up any ownership of your property by entering into a conservation easement. You are partnering with that land trust to ensure that the terms of that conservation easement remain. Because let's say you sell it 2 or 3 times down the road and somebody decides, hey, I sure would like to put a strip center in here, and you're gone. But that land trust is the one that's going to step in there and say, no, absolutely not. This conservation easement precludes that. Once it's drafted and put together and conveyed at a closing that would be a lot like a real estate closing, that conservation easement is going to be recorded down at the courthouse. just like any other land record. And that way, that ensures a couple of things. One, that conservation easement, what we call as lawyers, runs with the land, which means no matter how many times that land is sold or whose hands it winds up in, the conservation easement travels with the land. You can never separate the two once it's conveyed. The second piece of filing it down at the courthouse is it lets anyone looking at the piece of property or otherwise maybe moving in next to us or potentially buying it, it's of record. It's going to show to everyone that this property has the benefit of a conservation easement on top of it. A few other details that people often raise, what happens if you still owe the bank some money on your piece of property? Not a problem. But in order for a conservation easement to work its magic, to absolutely ensure that there is no development that takes place on that, the conservation easement has to be number one in the pecking order in terms of interest in the property. So if you've got a loan right now, your bank is probably number one to protect their rights to ensure payment of the loan. And when you do one of these conservation easements, you or your counsel will reach out to your bank and they will do what's called a subordination, which says, hey, we understand this is for the benefit of the tract. We're not harmed by this transaction, and we will sign a document that says our lien is still valid, but the conservation easement is now going to rise to the very top of the pecking order. So just because you have a loan or owe the bank some amount of money on your property in no way is an impediment to doing one of these transactions. Okay, so a little more detail now on what is a conservation easement. What is that document? It becomes part of the title to land. If you can think of maybe your property as a layer cake right now, and there are certain layers there, in this conservation easement, you're going to take a few of those layers, like the ability to build a commercial facility or condos or housing development, and you're going to separate those layers from the underlying ownership. You're going to convey those layers over to the land trust and say that no one can have those layers anymore because they've been conveyed away. But it still maintains one common interest in the title to the land. You can sell it, gift it. In a conservation easement in no way prohibits you from passing this on to your children, your grandchildren through your will, or selling a piece of property. Many times families that go to the point of putting the conservation easement, the land is so integral to their family, they will probably never sell it. But likewise, there are many people who believe so much in pieces of property and preserving them forever. They may buy it, live on it for some period of time, engage in one of these transactions to ensure that tract is forever preserved, and then they'll put it back on the market. They'll sell it. And there's actually, believe it or not, there's quite a community out there now of conservation buyers, people who are attracted to a piece of property, knowing that there's not going to be any development on that tract. As I mentioned before, the conservation easement, it's binding on all future owners. We like to joke in this world that, the second or third generation, there's always one grandkid that is ornery and maybe a little more interested in money than deer hunting. And too bad for that grandchild. This is going to prevent them. It will be bad news to them. So long after you're gone, it's going to ensure that anybody that owns that property, whether they're related to you or not, they have to abide by that. Because now is probably a pretty good moment to explain this partnership that I've talked about with a land trust. It's very important in the early due diligence part of doing one of these to reach out to HCLT, Texas Land Conservancy, or one of the other land trusts in Texas, and just talk to them. I mean, they're not going to ask for any money. They're not going to be imposing at all. They're nonprofits who are dedicated to this, so they will be happy to talk to you they take on a big role here. When one of these transactions is done, they agree to perpetually, forever, take on the responsibility for this piece of property and making sure that it's preserved. So these land trusts are truly, truly remarkable organizations. There aren't any others like them in Texas. To say, hey, our mission is to maintain this area of the Hill Country permanently. So real credit to them for taking on that role. This easement's going to selectively remove rights from the title of the land, like I talked about, for development. Likewise, other aspects, there's some limitations on mineral production I'll talk about in a minute, but it's going to define in great detail what rights have been removed and then what rights are reserved to the landowner. And then lastly, I mentioned every easement is going to be tailored to the property, and every land trust in Texas has got a slightly different personality and slightly different approach to all those things, and each of them somewhat has their own form of a conservation easement. Okay, where does a conservation easement come from? This is the legal part of your Friday morning, but it's provided for. The Texas legislature in the Natural Resources Code has fully permitted conservation easements to be done, and it's provided for by statute. But probably the biggest piece of law that is important to this conversation is, you may be surprised to know, is the Federal Internal Revenue Code. Conservation easements are a creature of the tax law, the federal tax law, and that's for a great purpose. There are some fairly eye-popping and stunning tax benefits to doing these transactions that our speakers, a little later this morning, are going to go into detail on that. So more on that later, but that's why it's in the Internal Revenue Code. Been around for decades and decades, but a conservation easement under the Internal Revenue Code, it's got to have one of these essential purposes up here. And you really only have to have one of these. I'll run through protection of significant natural resources, including water or endangered species. That one is probably what we see day to day. More conservation easements are directed at that one. Protection of historical resources. Tiffany could give us a long discussion on that, but there are many landowners who discover burial grounds, arrowheads, other really, really neat historical features on their property, and you can do a conservation easement for that purpose, to ensure your property is preserved such that those historical artifacts are forever protected. Public access for recreation or education, that they are used for trails. You've probably, if you're a trail hiker, you've probably been over a trail that has been provided for in a conservation easement. You may not have known it. And then lastly, for the growing urban areas that we've got in Texas, open space. That's a big one. As we grow more and more, and certainly during COVID, we know we need more access to open space and green places to take kids. And a conservation easement can fulfill that role too. You can create a conservation easement to provide what amounts to a privately owned park, such that people can come on. I'll mention related to that, just because it typically comes up at this point as a question. People say, okay, this sounds intriguing, but if I do one of these, put it over my 500 acres, am I going to be giving public access to my property? And the answer to that is no, unless you specifically agree and specifically provide in that conservation easement that I want trails on here, or I want the public to be able to come on my property, or school kids. It's not going to happen. That's a decision that's up to you. So a conservation easement itself doesn't open up to public access. Okay, a few basics here. I mean, we've kind of talked about what this document will be, and that we would have some form of closing when you actually sign the paper. These things ideally take 1.5 years, sometimes 2 years. And that may seem like a long time, but I can assure you the best ones are the ones where the parties proceed in a deliberate pace, because they're getting to know one another and you're making decisions that are going to be permanent to the property. So taking your time. But eventually you're going to wind up in a conference room or somewhere where here's the conservation easement, and you're being asked to sign that, and they're going to go down to the courthouse to convey it. And most real estate closings are pretty dull and boring. Conservation easement closings are more like a real celebration of the property. I have seen some people come to tears at that, just at the joy of preserving that property. It's really that meaningful. But at the closing, there are different ways that you might be compensated for doing this. The primary one up there at the top is a donated easement. When you do one of these projects, you will have an appraiser, and that appraiser is going to appraise your property as it is today. He or she is also going to make an appraisal and look at that conservation easement and say, I'm going to study what rights are you giving away and what rights are you keeping. And then we'll make a calculation and say, well, this is the market value that you are giving away if you sign this piece of paper today. And if you do 100% donated easement, that value that you're giving away is going to generate a tax deduction that you can use against your income, your federal income tax liability. So if you're getting no money, you are going to get 100% of the value of that donation that you're making, and then you can carry that out up to 15 years and use it against your income tax. The second is a purchased easement. You know what that value is going to be. There are situations that happen. They are somewhat rare, but we have a couple of good resources for dollars to compensate landowners. One is NRCS, has an elaborate program, and that's the USDA, where they fund conservation easements either in total or in part. Then secondly, we have a program here in Texas at Parks and Wildlife, which I'll talk about briefly at the end here. And those two sources oftentimes can provide dollars. And then thirdly, the land trust itself may have some funds, but again, these are rare. But you can be paid cash money for the total value that you're giving away. Thirdly is simply a combination of the two, which we do see. Sometimes there are dollars, but they're nowhere near enough dollars to match that value the appraiser has calculated. So you're going to get some money at closing, then likewise you will get a deduction for the rest of it to count back against your income tax over time. So what's this process look like? Let's say you're somewhat intrigued by our discussion here this morning and think, okay, this piece of property that I love, my kids love, and I really would like to see if this is something I'm interested in. The first process in the due diligence, do some reading. There's some great materials out there from the land trust we have, or an organization called the Texas Land Trust Council that I have served on the board on. There's some great materials on their website. But the process is the same, whether you're donating the easement or whether you're going to get dollars for that. And as you begin to grow your relationship with the land trust, you're going to work with them, talking about, okay, what's your future goals for the property? What rights do you want to reserve? A couple of key decision points are, one, what we call envelopes. Let's say you've got 500 acres and 2 kids, and you think, well, they may want to move back to this property and build houses here. If you want to provide for an area for your children to build houses on the property, you're going to need to define where those areas are and what size those are. These tend to be 5 acres in size. It's up to you and the land trust to define where they are, but given that this is a permanent transaction, you're going to have to think through that process to say, hey, where do I want those envelopes to be, and define those on a map. Similarly, if your property is an ag use and you think you may want to build barns, working pens, things like that, additional ag structures, you may choose to create an envelope, which is nothing more than a square on a map where construction can take place in the future. Other decision point is what we call a partition, which is nothing more than the ability to divide the property. If you say you've got that 500 acres, you can define in the conservation easement that the property can be divided into separate parcels no more than X times. We tend to see 0 to 3, depending on the size of the tract. These decisions I'm telling you about, the envelopes, however many envelopes you choose and however many divisions to the property you choose, also are going to impact that tax deduction. The fewer rights that you reserve, the higher that tax deduction is going to be. I mentioned the process of the appraisal. I won't go into great detail. You don't really need to know that from where you're at today, but the appraiser is one of the most valuable players on your team in this process, because if this is going to be part of a tax deduction, their calculation and detailed appraisal of the rights you're giving up is going to be critical. Another document I'm going to throw out at you, which is probably when a landowner comes away from that closing table, is the one they're fascinated with the most, is called a baseline report. And when we do these, right before, literally the day of the signature on that conservation easement, there's going to be an expert, could be the land trust, could be somebody, a private consultant, but is going to go out and they will have studied your property in granular detail. So much so that you may have owned it for 50 years, and I'll bet they find things on your property that you don't even know are there. Lost springs, the types of grasses, the blends of grasses. And that baseline is going to be, in essence, an encyclopedia of the property. But it serves an important legal purpose going forward. It's going to document exactly what condition the property is in on the date that you conveyed that conservation easement. And so in the event 20 years, 50 years, wherever down the road, if there is ever a discussion or dispute as to what condition that property was in, that baseline is what's going to define. Some other just pieces, if you were looking at one of these conservation easements, you know, the elements in it or the sections in it, you're going to have a purpose clause, which sounds boring, but really that's where you're going to define, look, my property has scenic vistas, my property has critical waterways, my property has springs, or it's in the recharge zone. You're going to define those up front and state the preservation of these areas is the purpose of this easement. Same with conservation values. You're going to say this is why my property is unique and needs to be preserved. Then you'll get into the details of restrictions and reserved rights that I told you about. And then finally, there are administrative sections. And that deals with what happens if that, you know, honorary grandchild from Dallas decides to pull a bulldozer on there and start doing something. These easements are going to define what the legal rights are for the land trust to, you start out writing a letter reminding them, and then they can go all the way, if it gets that bad, to actually go to court to enforce them. It's very rare that that happens, but those rights are there in favor of the land trust. Other aspects, you know, construction on the property, why I mentioned those envelopes is construction will take place within those envelopes, but be prohibited otherwise. So you're going to define, okay, where will the roads be? And once you do a conservation easement, somebody can't say, well, you know what, I think we need to put a house over there. That's going to be prohibited. You know, it prohibits most types of what we'll call surface alteration. Any open pit mining is absolutely prohibited. And, you know, scraping areas, creating unauthorized roads, that sort of thing, are likewise going to be detailed in that conservation easement. But the land uses, as I mentioned, agriculture is all going to be preserved. There'd be no impediment to that. If you have row crop area, that's going to be permitted. Grazing, hunting, there's not going to be any impact to those at all. Surface mining is absolutely prohibited. Oil and gas development, I will, since time is limited, I'm just going to briefly state that you can have oil and gas development on your property and still do a conservation easement. I hear all the time somebody say, well, you know, I do one of these, but I have oil and gas, or I think I may have oil and gas. The two of them can be done together. Now, there are some specific things that have to be done to tie up and restrict the mineral rights such that you don't have just wide open development on the surface of the property for oil and gas. But for today's discussion, understand that one doesn't preclude the other. So if you're in an area that has valuable mineral rights or even production that's in place, you can do it. Groundwater extraction. Groundwater is huge nowadays in Texas, not only for use, but there's a thriving economy for groundwater rights out there. Typically, conservation easements are going to have language in them that says, look, the owner and any future owner can utilize all of the groundwater for whatever purpose they choose for the surface of the property, but they are prohibited from pumping that groundwater to sell it for commercial uses off of the property. So it's a good tool for sort of groundwater preservation, if you will. I'll breeze through this. There are administrative sections regarding monitoring and enforcement. The land trusts, typically, each one is different, but almost all of them do an annual visit to the property, see how things are going. New landowners to this tend to view this as, whoa, they're controlling, they're going to be acting like the sheriff and telling me what to do. It's just not that way at all. They tend to be a partner in this process, and they'll do a ride around with you, make sure everything's going good, and be a resource for advice. You know, I mentioned the minerals, and I won't go into any greater detail because it's fairly complex. It's much easier if you own 100% of the minerals. If you're in the core of the Hill Country, there is a process called a mineral remoteness letter, and we would retain an expert that would look and say, look, you know, the likelihood of any mineral production here in the Hill Country is so remote it's negligible, and that will cover the mineral interest risk there, such that you can get your deduction from the Internal Revenue Code. You know, a few other things, you know, almost all of them are perpetual. Legally, you can do a term conservation easement, one that is just for a period of years, but those are really not done very often at all. Condemnation, huge topic here that I wish I had time for, but we don't. I will tell you, a conservation easement itself does not prohibit or prevent condemnation. That's a threat all landowners are facing in Texas, but just because you do a conservation easement doesn't ward off like magic the threat of condemnation. Now, it may convince somebody who's doing a project that, hey, we don't want to mess with that and go a different direction, but it doesn't legally prohibit it. One small exception to that is if you do get an award of funds from Texas Parks and Wildlife as part of your conservation easement process, there's some special statutory language that requires the entity to look at other feasible alternatives rather than coming through your property. So that is valuable language if you do get those funds.
Jim, we've got about 1 more minute before we need to transition to questions.
All right. Well, thanks for the reminder because I love to talk. So thank you for keeping me on track. I talked to you about the land trusts. You've got 2 great ones here today. And if you want to look at others, check the Texas Land Trust Council. You know, the last thing that I wanted to talk about, I'll leave the financial to Margaret and Kathryn later, is just, you know, the Texas Farm and Ranch Land Program at Parks and Wildlife. It's really a pretty neat program. They divide up $2 million of state funds each biennium, and then grant those projects out, and then use those leverage dollars to ensure we're conserving more and more of Texas. There's some selection criteria, and this will give you an idea of the broad array of where we're preserving properties all over the state using those state colors. So, you know, maybe with that, I'll stand up for any questions if there are any, Tiffany or Daniel.
We have got plenty of questions. I'm going to pose one, and then I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany to ask the rest. The first question comes from Paula. Can a conservation easement be applied to a 10-acre tract within the Fredericksburg ETJ? That land is planned to be a nature park in 20 years, planned by an owner in her will.
Yeah, great question there, which has several pieces to it. I mean, how can you do one that is for a tract that is small in size? And the answer is yes. I mean, legally, there is no minimum size on a conservation easement. You know, 10 acres, it certainly can be done. You have to sort of, that's something you would be working with the land trust, say, hey, is this 10 acres so critical? And of course, it sounds to me like it is. It's headed to be a park. It's in Fredericksburg. That kind of thing is in short supply. So really, the answer to that is yes. It is entirely appropriate to do one of that size.
Thanks, Jim. That kind of addressed one of my questions that I see in the chat as well, asking about minimum acreage, but also about minimum value. And I think the answer is really the same there. You agree?
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, yeah. If you go out to Trans-Pecos, far west Texas, then, you know, somebody's probably not going to do a 10-acre conservation easement. But if you get into Austin, Dallas, Fredericksburg, 10 acres, number one, is very valuable from a dollar perspective, but it's also very valuable in terms of preserving that acreage in that environment. So good question.
Great. And then another one of the questions that we received, you answered, but I'll go ahead. There's a second one that's related. So the first one was, can eminent domain be used to take and change the use of land that has a conservation easement on it? You addressed that. And then someone else asked, please define condemnation.
Condemnation, if I use the word eminent domain, that would probably be, those two words mean the same thing. But what that means is that's the law that allows that the government, let's say Texas, the city, the county, or even private entities like pipeline companies, electric utilities, or others, to come in and forcibly take an easement across your property, or take some portion of your private property and put it to use for one of their projects. That's what we call condemnation and eminent domain. Those two terms really cover the same thing.
Jim, one more question. It's a big question, but what can we expect in the upcoming legislative session in terms of discussions around eminent domain? And then related, you know, a lot of the landowners perhaps on this call have had direct or indirect impacts from the Permian Highway Pipeline. For folks who want to get involved in those discussions around reform of eminent domain, you know, what are the opportunities? Where can they go?
Yeah, a very good question, and I'll try to be succinct, but that's a big topic, but very important. You know, we've all learned, you know, in the last decade, and then with the Permian Pipeline project in the wonderful Hill Country, Wimberley, Fredericksburg, and in between, it's given a lot of people a real bitter lesson at how imbalanced that law is. Definitely going to be an odd legislative session with COVID and the budget. But with respect to eminent domain, I expect you're going to see multiple bills filed by several different sources here to reform these laws in favor of landowners. The demand for this has grown and grown. The last two sessions have been a very, very hot topic. Last session, the TREAD Coalition, if you're familiar with that, had certain bills in the session, and then the private property groups, the Texas Wildlife Association, Cattle Raisers, and Farm Bureau had their own package, which got quite a long ways through the legislature. Those packages are coming back. Those groups are all going to be back demanding protection for landowners. I think one of the primary areas that's going to be requested in light of the Permian is shouldn't pipelines be put over at the Public Utility Commission like transmission lines for routing and such that landowners can participate and question whether the project is even needed or not. So I know a lot of groups are aiming for that this session to say, look, we want a state agency in Texas to be involved looking at these projects before they start coming through our front fence to bulldoze our property.
Jim, thank you so much. For folks who might have additional questions, how do they get in touch with you? Where do they go?
Yeah, great to be with you guys. This is it's fun to do this, but it's fun to do it with friends. So thank you all for having me. You know, if you want to get in touch with me, there's my email down there. I'm not hard to find, so you can email me if you've got another question. And you know, if you guys want, I'll be happy to send you a PDF of the presentation. You guys can flip that out to whoever wants it. So y'all have a great rest of the conference, and I'm going to continue watching.
All right. Well, everybody, thanks so much. Thanks to Jim and Steve for their great presentations. We now have Margaret Menicucci and Kathryn Tancig, both attorneys at Braun and Gresham, who are going to build on that foundation to get into sort of the nuances of tax and financial considerations of conservation easements. So with that, Margaret and Kathryn, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Kathryn, I think, just stepped away. I'm going to get started and she'll get back online fairly quickly. Daniel, I appreciate being here, and I am really, it's always really helpful when Jim Bradbury goes first because he gives you such a great overview of conservation easement information, and it enables Kathryn and I to drill down on some more specific topics. And so we're going to talk today principally, we're going to focus on some of the tax benefits and then some other financial considerations, and that's going to relate in large part to transaction costs. I'm going to make sure that we give some time at the end so that you can have your questions and we can have a little discussion. And I do want those questions to be broad. If you still have some ideas kind of left over from Jim's discussion, Kathryn and I are completely able to help and answer those questions as well. At the end of Jim's discussion, you were talking about what to expect in the next legislative session, and he mentioned the TREAD Coalition, and I do have a website for that, and at the end of this speech I'll go ahead and put that on the chat so that you have a link to see if you want more information about the TREAD Coalition, which is a coalition of landowners working on rural landowner issues. Okay. Real quickly, Kathryn and I, like Daniel said, are from Braun and Gresham. Braun and Gresham is a law firm really dedicated to helping rural landowners, and we're also affiliated with Plateau Land and Wildlife and Plateau Land Group. I'm going to focus, like I said, on tax benefits today. And I just saw Kathryn come on the screen. Before I get started, Kathryn, did you want to just say hello?
Yeah, thank you everybody for having me here. Margaret's going to focus on the tax benefits, and then I'll talk about kind of the difference in available options for selling a conservation easement as well as donating, and then getting our transaction team together, some of those transaction costs as well. So thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks, Kathryn. You know, I say to a lot of people that, you know, you don't donate a conservation easement simply for the tax benefits. I think when my clients do a conservation easement, it's because they have a conservation ethic and they have some strong personal reasons to preserve the land and often preserve their family's legacy, or have an opportunity, if it's newly acquired land, to them to make a difference in the community. But those tax benefits are really important, and they help it be the type of transaction that can help the family quite a bit. And so I'm going to go over principally income tax benefits, because those are the largest benefits. So you do, if you do a donation of a conservation easement and you comply with the requirements that are necessary, ones that IRS sets forth, then you can qualify for an income tax deduction. And that's what we're going to focus on today. But other tax benefits are that you do end up having a lower appraised value of the land in the estate, because by giving up the development rights, you have given up a significant portion of the value. And so if you have an estate that's starting to bump into estate tax territory, this is one of those tools that we can use to help reduce the state and avoid federal estate tax. There could be some property tax relief, especially if you're going from some kind of market value and through the conservation easement, you're doing more habitat management and wildlife. And in some states like Colorado, there's actually a tax credit. Those latter ones are kind of beyond the time we have today, but they're good to keep in mind, and if they apply to you, worth researching. So I want to just go over an example of how we value the CE so that we know how we get a number for the tax deduction. So the value of a conservation easement is the difference between the fair market value of the land at its highest and best use and the fair market value of the land after you put all those easements, rights, and restrictions on it. And so highest and best use is really important. If your land is close to an urban area, then its highest and best use starts migrating toward being a subdivision. And if you give up those subdivision rights, then you have changed the value significantly. And so my numbers today are all hypothetical numbers to help us kind of understand the value and the income tax consequences, but I just wanted to introduce them here. So let's assume we've got a piece of rural land that's near an urban area, and it's worth $8 million in its highest and best use, and that's if it can be sold, likely to be a suburban subdivision. If you put a conservation easement on it, and depending on what the restrictions are, today I'm assuming that it caused a 40% reduction in value, so that the land is now worth $4,800,000, sorry, instead of $8 million. And so what that gives us is $3.2 million as the value of the conservation easement. It's that difference. And that's going to be what your charitable donation is. This is assuming a fully donated easement. This slide now starts giving you an idea of how that donation affects and your tax savings. I'm going to assume that the donor has a very good AGI, adjusted gross income, of $250,000. And at that rate, they're taxed at 24%. Then we're going to have our donation. It's $3.2 million. It's the charitable donation that the donor made. And they get to use that donation by applying, I'm trying to phrase this right, by taking a credit of up to half of their adjusted gross income each year. So out of that 3.2 million, in the first year, they get to claim 125,000 as a donation on their income tax. And that's going to reduce the adjusted gross income to 125,000, which actually, for starters, puts them in a different tax rate. And their tax savings is going to be, in my hypothetical, about $30,000 a year. And what's really unique about a conservation easement is after the first year, you still get 15 more years to carry over your tax deduction and to keep using it. If this were a straight donation of land to a charity, like I'm leaving a portion of my land to the local hospital, then you'd only have a 5-year carryover. But conservation easements have an extended carryover of 15 years. And so you get a total of 16 years to use that deduction. So my assumptions, like I said, are hypothetical. We're assuming that the donor has that $250,000 AGI every year for 16 years. Their total tax savings is going to be $480,000. But because they can only use $125,000 a year, they're still going to have some unused deduction, and I calculate that to be $1.2 million. So they'll have used up $2 million of their tax deduction over 16 years, but they're going to have some left over, and we're going to talk about that in a couple minutes. Now, the tax code treats a qualified farmer or rancher differently and considerably better. And so to be a qualified farmer or rancher, you have to be deriving 50% of your adjusted gross income from farming and ranching activities. But if you made that qualification, then you can apply the deduction to all of your AGI. It's a 100% AGI deduction. And so in that case, each year, that donor who's a farmer or rancher is able to reduce their taxes by reducing their adjusted gross income to 0, giving them an annual tax savings, in my hypothetical, of $60,000 a year. We get 16 years to use it, your 15-year carryover, recall, and they have a total tax savings of $780,000. And if you notice at the bottom, in this case, the deduction's used up in about 13 years. So they got all the way through that 3.2 million. One of the things some of our families ask us to do when they're donors is say, ooh, you know, I see that I'm going to get this great deduction, but I really can't use it. I'm retired. I don't have a huge adjusted gross income. And so is there any way that I can help other family members benefit from this? And one strategy is to put, before you make the donation, to create a business entity and hold the land in that business entity, and then gift some of those entity shares to other family members. So in this case, here's our example. Mom and Dad Landowner, they form Family Ranch LLC, and they transfer all the rural land to the LLC. And then they make a gift of LLC interest, 48%, to their 2 children. So they're retaining 52% in this hypothetical, so they can retain control. There's other ways to retain control as well, like making voting shares and things like that. Now, you got to keep in mind that this gift of the LLC interests, and you've got an LLC holding an $8 million piece of property, is going to create a gift tax event. That's going to be a gift that is reportable on a gift tax return, and in our situation, it's subject to the gift tax unified credit, which right now is over 11 million per person. So it will use up some of the gift and estate tax credit, but it likely won't trigger a gift tax obligation. The children, as the members of the LLC, then have the opportunity to participate in that charitable deduction that's received from donating the conservation easement. And here's kind of an example of how those numbers work. So Mom and Dad, in our hypothetical, had the $250,000 annual income. They own 52% of the LLC, and so they're getting 1.6 plus of that deduction. Given the kind of calculations I showed you earlier, they're going to be able to use up all of that deduction in 13 years. And of course, my hypothetical assumes a level income that whole time. Then they have another child, and she's in tech, and she's making all kinds of money, and she's got a $400,000 annual income. She's now a 24% owner of the LLC, and she's going to get $768,000 of that deduction. She'll be able to use that up in 4 years. Then we have another child doing very well, $150,000 annual income. He also owns 24% of the LLC. He gets that same $768,000, and is able to use all of it in 10 years. So this is a situation in which instead of leaving 1.2 of the deduction kind of unused, the whole family was able to benefit. Now, when you do gift shares to your children, it's not simply that you're incurring a gift tax, but you are kind of creating this family company and more people that are involved potentially in decision making. But it's also really a great opportunity to get your younger family members involved in managing the ranch and being stewards. That, I think, is all I've got because I wanted to respect our time. And I'm going to pass it on to Kathryn. And then if you have questions about the tax consequences, we can talk about those at the end.
Thanks, Margaret. Margaret just went through the tax benefits of donating a conservation easement. But sometimes there are specific funding sources available for the purchase and sale of conservation easements. Some of the examples of these programs include the City of Austin, Travis County. There are also federal programs. The Great American Outdoors Act just recently passed, which will guarantee funding for the federal government to obtain lands for conservation easements as well. So just wanted to make everybody aware that there is the opportunity for the sale of conservation easements as well as the donation of conservation easements. On some of these deals, when there is a sale, sometimes the entire purchase price is not available. So what you can have is a combination, which is referred to commonly as a bargain sale, where a portion of the conservation easement value is paid for, and then a portion of those real estate interests are donated to the easement holder. Okay. So in order to basically put together some of these conservation deals, it takes a lot of different professionals, and we like to refer that to our transaction team. So, number one, you've got to have an easement holder, a land trust, a government entity, some organization that is qualified under state law and federal law to hold conservation easements. You've got several of those on this program today. The next step, of course, is determining what the value of the conservation easement is. And so the individual who does that is a conservation easement appraiser, and they will look at the property, have an on-site inspection, figure out what the value of the property is, the fair market value of the property is prior to the restrictions in the easement being placed on the property. And then they'll also determine what the restrictions or what the property is worth after those restrictions have been placed. And that's where you might be hearing this before and after value concept. And then once you have the before and after, it's a simple subtraction problem, and then you're left with the value of the conservation easement. So our appraiser is very, very important. You also need a baseline documentation report, which gives you a snapshot of what the property looks like at the time the gift or the conservation easement is sold. This document is used by the land trust or the easement holder to ensure that the restrictions and terms included in the conservation easement are upheld on the property and can be used for monitoring and enforcement purposes into perpetuity. We also, as landowner representatives, view this document as very important for the landowner as well. It helps the landowner to know and remember exactly what the property looked like at that time, and can also help them have those monitoring and enforcement conversations with land trusts. In addition, when landowners or grantors of easements, perhaps they transfer or convey the underlying fee simple to the next landowner, and then again, that baseline report would be very important for the subsequent owner. Sometimes you don't have to have a survey for a property, but oftentimes, especially if you're dealing with a government entity who's purchasing a conservation easement, it's good to know exactly what area or configuration of property you are conveying, and the survey can help us do that. The IRS doesn't specifically require it, but it is a best management practice from my perspective, and I'm sure many of the people here would maybe go even a little further than that. But we also recommend to our clients that if there hasn't been a recent survey, that we get a recent survey so that the legal description is accurate. Sometimes too, you might have a parent tract of property and want to convey an easement on a portion of that land, and the survey can be helpful in that scenario as well. Lately, I've also been making sure to put the building envelopes, not necessarily meets and bounds descriptions, but including, you know, the configuration of the building envelope, maybe pinning it with a coordinate on the corner on a survey, so that you know, the IRS doesn't view those as floating, and the landowner and the land trust can know where that is located. Sometimes in order to substantiate the appraisal values, a land plan can be useful. For example, if you have a ranch that is 500 acres and there's a lot of water and creeks and features on the property, you might be able to divide that ranch up into smaller ranchettes, and the appraiser would benefit from being able to see that document. So sometimes if you are you know, planning on doing something with the property, you can use a land planner to kind of substantiate what could be possible, even though that's not what's going to happen after the conservation easement is recorded. But that's not always necessary. Very important are our CPAs and financial planning professionals. There are significant consequences and benefits to these transactions, and it's important to have qualified financial advisors involved as well. So we always appreciate it when our landowners have a CPA who is familiar with conservation easements. Sometimes they're not always. They are still relatively new concept in some professions, obviously not ours. And then of course you have your legal team, attorneys, things like that. And again, I think that this also includes the land trust and the other entities on the other side of the transaction. Margaret? Okay, so those are a lot of professionals, a lot of professional fees. So I think one question that we always get from landowners is, how much is this going to cost, or what is it going to take in terms of resources for the landowner? You know, one very important item is that when you donate a conservation easement to a land trust is often asking for a stewardship contribution or an endowment. Every land trust has their different way of calculating what that amount would be in order to properly monitor and enforce the conservation easement restrictions into perpetuity. Some of the factors that are considered there are how far is the property from headquarters, you know, things like that. The appraisal costs, the baseline, typically that's, depending on who you obtain for an appraiser, it can be on the lower end, 5,000 maybe even, or it can be on the higher end if it's a bigger property with more complex issues. For example, if you are retaining a piece of property from that parent tract that's going to be on the outside of the easement, there might be some enhancement analysis that need to be done, and that appraisal might become more expensive. Or if there are several different ownership entities, things like that can drive up the cost of an appraisal. The baseline report, typically the land trust will do those in-house, and some land trusts will ask for those costs to be reimbursed. Some will do more fundraising to cover those kinds of costs and staff time. And the landowners very much always appreciate when the land trust does take on that responsibility, but sometimes the landowners are can benefit from having an independent contractor basically do the baseline report. We've had that happen a couple times, but most of the times it's the land trust that's going to be paying for that, or absorbing those costs rather. The landowner is often asked to provide a title policy that would benefit the land trust or the easement holder, ensuring the title interests of the conservation easement that is conveyed. That title policy is proportionate to the sales price or the appraised value of the conservation easement. So sometimes, again, depending on how much that property or interests are worth, it can be, you know, as little as $5,000 or as much as $20,000, depending on what the conservation easement is worth. Surveys, exhibits, again, those are just specific costs that would be involved if a survey is needed. Mineral remoteness letter, if the mineral rights are determined to be severed from the current owner as shown in the title report or commitment, then the IRS requires that a certified geologist look into the ability of whether those minerals can be developed. That's because the IRS requires qualified real estate interests to be conveyed in order for the contribution to qualify. So a geologist would need to look at the property and make a determination as to whether the ability to develop those minerals is so remote as to be negligible, which is the legal standard. And those letters, you know, if you get them early enough in the year without having to expedite them, you can get them from $1,500 to $2,000. Environmental hazard reports, if there's a purchase easement, a government entity will want to do an environmental phase 1 to make sure that they're not acquiring an environmental liability, that there's not some dump or chemicals that have been deposited on the property. Typically, the government entity will pay for that report, given that it's really up to them to make sure that that's, you know, that it's their responsibility. They kind of want the report to be addressed to them so that they are comfortable with that. Closing and recording costs, those are usually typically minor, but there are costs for actually closing the transaction. And then we've already kind of talked about those other things, and of course the professional fees. So I'm not sure, I think that's probably good enough. And if there are any questions, we're happy to answer them. So thank you again for having us today.
Yeah, so this last slide is just to inspire y'all in case you didn't have any questions for us. One thing I wanted to add after Kathryn talking, when she talked about the sale of a conservation easement, and she mentioned that it's usually a bargain sale. It really is. It's usually you have some compensation for the conservation easement and you're also making a donation. So in those situations, you've still got that donation, which is going to help you with taxes, principally in the first year, because with the sale of the conservation easement, you've got a fairly large income event. And so I just wanted to mention how those interact, because I focused a lot on the carryover if you're doing a straight donation. But our experience, and it could be different, is that if you do a sale and a bargain sale, then most of the time, much of the donation is used up in the first year or the first couple years. So Tiffany or Daniel, I saw that you kind of received questions by chat. How can we answer some questions for this group?
Yeah, we sure did receive a few. Let's see, one of them is it worth creating a conservation easement on a long, skinny 22-acre property if the land on either side is not under a conservation easement?
Kathryn, you want to take
it? Sure. So I'm not going to answer that question exactly because I don't want to provide any legal advice today. That's my caveat. But I think that, 22 acres, I'm just going to say it, is pretty small. So in order to have a conservation easement qualify for the tax benefits, you have to have conservation purposes of the easement. And for example, you have to be conserving significant or relatively natural habitat, things like that. So I think that the question of whether that particular piece is worth conserving, and don't get me wrong, I think every single acre is worth conserving, no matter how small it is. But you would have to find an easement holder that would be willing to take that property. But lately I've seen easements more starting at the 100-acre range. But again, if this particular piece has a recharge feature on it or a sinkhole or something like that, then there may be an argument or a land trust that wants to hold that piece of property.
So it sounds like, Kathryn, that maybe the other thing is, what can a landowner do if they have a small piece of property that they care deeply about, that they think is something they'd want to preserve, is like a first step for them to reach out to the land trust community and maybe get people out there to walk it with them and kind of understand what the conservation resources are?
Yeah, absolutely. And, also don't be deterred if you can't find somebody that's interested in holding that easement. There are other mechanisms under the law, such as restrictive covenants, that can protect land. They're not as restrictive covenants don't protect the land in perpetuity, but there are other options for conserving a piece of property. And the land trust can talk with you about what their concerns are, whether they're interested, and then we're always happy to consult with people individually looking at their specific piece of property, as well as far as their conservation options that are available to them.
Yeah, I agree. In all of these questions of is a piece of property too small, the answer is pretty much always it depends, and it depends on if you can find a partner. So I'd encourage folks to reach out to a couple or 3 land trusts, talk to them about their personalities, sort of what interests they have. In some cases, on the other side of the country, a 22-acre conservation easement is fairly large. So, it depends, but I definitely encourage as well reaching out to your land trust. So we have, that brings up another one. To what extent is this seminar information specific to Texas law versus federal and maybe county, et cetera?
So, my piece about taxes is really focused on the federal tax code, because it's your income tax charitable donation. As I mentioned, I think depending on the state you're in, you should get to know, are there other tax benefits to us? As I mentioned, Colorado can give you a tax credit if you're preserving land there and you're also paying income taxes in Colorado. But I would say a lot of this is driven by federal law. Kathryn, your answer might be a little different.
Yeah, I think too, in order for a conservation easement to qualify for the federal contribution, the conservation contribution, it has to be valid under state law. So I think, it's really, everything that I'm saying, I'm licensed in both Florida and Texas. So, particularly I'm talking to a crowd here today that's from Texas. So I would say that everything I've said is specific to Texas and federal law, as well as basics from other states such as Florida. So we kind of kept our presentation a little bit broad today. So when you get into certain specifics, that's where you're going to find that differentiation really important.
And we have one last question from Ryland Howard here about a needed provision in wills, trusts, and entity agreements to allow executors, trustees, and partners to enter into conservation easement. That can be a major estate planning consideration, and that otherwise we may not be able to execute the CE. Margaret, do you want to tackle that? Or
yeah, so I am, I do conservation easement work, so I am principally an estate planner, and because a lot of our clients, as they're doing their estate planning, conservation easement is a big component. And I agree. So I think I'm just kind of going to repeat the comment is, as you're doing your estate planning, and often if you have like a revocable trust for your estate plan tool, or you have a will, one of the things that you want to think about, if this is something in your future or something that's important to you, is empowering that executor or that trustee to do a conservation easement transaction. And that's kind of in the event that you didn't get it done. And one of the reasons it's important for that to be specific in the trust or the will is because we talked at the beginning, the conservation easement transaction, if you look at it just on paper, actually devalues an asset. It takes some, it gives some of the value away. And I think there's been concerns at times when you have a trustee that doesn't appreciate the goals and the importance of the conservation easement, that they're going to struggle saying, well, I have a fiduciary duty to the beneficiaries. How can I devalue an asset? And so what we like to do, and what I do in my documents, is I specifically authorize the donation or sale of a conservation easement by the executor or trustee to effectuate your long-term plans, and so that trustee's not having cold feet.
Margaret and Kathryn, thank you so much. We are out of time for this session, but how do folks, if they have questions, if they want to get in touch with you, there it is.
There it is. Oh,
well, again,
there it went.
Thank y'all so much. And yeah, folks, if you have additional questions, don't be shy. Please reach out to Margaret and Kathryn. Thank y'all for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us. It means a lot.
Thank you.
All right, so we're gonna move on to our final presentation before we shift to our landowner panel. And to do so, I'd like to introduce Shane Kiefer. Shane is the Director of Ecological Services at Plateau Land and Wildlife Management. He is both a certified wildlife biologist, a registered property tax consultant. So Shane, if you want to share your screen.
Thank you, Daniel.
The figurative floor is yours.
How's that look? I'm going to assume y'all can see that since I didn't get an answer.
Yes, looks great.
Okay, good deal. Just making sure I'm sharing the right screen. Thank you, everybody. I'm happy to be here today. I hope everybody's having a wonderful Friday. It's a beautiful day here in Hays County. I'm going to talk with you about financial cost sharing opportunities. This is a pretty broad topic like all of these. And so I'm going to hit some highlights. And if you walk away from this or close your browser from this and can remember the names of these programs and where to go to find out more information, that's really the goal today. I want to give you a real brief overview of some of these. And you're on the right screen. Okay. I always like to mention when I talk about incentives for conservation, Texas's open space tax valuation. That is probably our largest and arguably most successful incentive for conservation in the state. If you've got an ag or a wildlife tax appraisal or timber appraisal in East Texas, then you understand the value of this tax incentive. And it is a real incentive for conservation. Its intent is to keep open space lands open. From a wildlife management perspective, the wildlife appraisal specifically requires you to do wildlife management activities. And as of 2019, there's over 6 million acres in the state that's under wildlife management appraisal. that's a lot of land that's incentivized with this tax benefit to property tax benefit to do wildlife management practices. Big major incentive program, and one that's fairly easy for everybody to tap into if you own rural land. On an entirely separate topic, anytime I mention that, I want to make sure that people understand that despite those big tax benefits, open space tax valuations do pay for themselves. Those lands pay more in taxes than they take in government resources. And so it is a net win all around. If you think you're not taking advantage of conservation incentives, if you're in open space valuation, you already are. Excuse me. My allergies are getting me this week. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about two programs through Texas Parks and Wildlife, Landowner Incentive Program, or LIP, and Pastures for Upland Birds, also known as PUB. I'm going to briefly mention these last two, the Grassland Restoration Incentives Program, and then a couple of NRCS programs, just so you're aware that they exist and can get more information later. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on those, but I want to give you a little more detail on LIP and PUB. Those are two programs that I find people aren't as familiar with as some of these other more traditional incentive programs. So LIP is a cost share funding program. Virtually all of these that I'm going to talk about are cost share programs. So they're not going to pay 100% of your project costs, but they are going to cover a significant portion. In the case of LIP, that's usually between 50 and 75% of the total project cost that you can get reimbursed for. The good news is that your contribution, your share of the cost, doesn't have to be cash out of pocket. It can be materials, it could be in-kind contributions of labor or equipment that can contribute to your portion of the cost share. So it doesn't necessarily have to come right out of your pocket. The payments on this and a lot of these others are based on the NRCS payment schedules. These are published schedules. They vary from year to year a little bit. These are two of the more recent ones I could find. I think these are 2020 reimbursement rates. I think they're current still. And so as an example, if you were under LIP, if you were to, your project was to plant vegetation to benefit pollinators, you could be reimbursed about $158 per acre for that practice. If you were doing brush management, this is herbicide treatments. IPT is individual plant treatment. And say mesquite or prickly pear, that's about $34 per acre reimbursement rate, I think, as of 2020. So it's not 50% of whatever you say the cost is going to be. There are some ceilings. There's kind of set prices that they'll reimburse at for a lot of these practices. And the nice thing about LIP is there's no minimum project size. These can be very small targeted projects. The example they use on their website is a small spring that they excluded livestock from to allow vegetation to regrow. So very small scale project, but with lots of benefits for that area. So there's no, it may be a few $1,000s is all that project costs, but you can still get reimbursement under LIP potentially to share some of that cost. Awards generally don't exceed about $40,000 from reimbursements. That's kind of the high end you could expect. But most of these projects are going to be somewhere in between there. So how do they decide what programs to fund? LIP currently has 3 funding series active. The watershed funding series, that is based on these priority watersheds. This map you see on the right, those gray areas are the current priority watersheds for the LIP watershed funding series. So if you're in that gray area, you're in a priority area that covers, as you can see, most of the Edwards Plateau and the Hill Country. So most of you are probably within that gray zone. The top projects are going to be projects in that gray zone that directly benefit Endangered Species Act listed species. So whatever your project is, if you can tie that benefit to an ESA listed species and you're in that gray area, you're going to be at the top of the list as far as LIP is concerned. Next level priority is going to be listed or candidate ESA species outside those gray areas. So if you're in the white zone there, those areas that aren't shaded in on that map, you can still get LIP funding. And again, if your project's benefiting an ESA listed or candidate species, that's going to raise your priority level. And that last here is just state or federal trust species. So these are other species of concern. There's a lot of them to choose from. The most iconic would be probably the Texas horned lizard. That's a state threatened species. If your project's benefiting Texas horned lizard, then you're still going to be up on that kind of third tier priority for LIP funding. This series has a application date, as it were. It's not a hard date, but the pre-proposals generally are going to be due in February of each year. For 2021, that's February 12th. The pre-proposal is simple, 1 to 2 pages, outline your project. That lets them quickly run through and decide which projects might be a high priority for further proposals and possible funding. The Conserving Texas River Series is a different pool of funding for LIP. It's targeting riparian zones and uplands in these listed watersheds here, Rio Grande, Llano, Pedernales, and Blanco. So if you're in one of those watersheds, you don't have to have riparian frontage. You don't have to have river frontage to qualify, because the uplands can count too. If you're in one of those watersheds, you might be eligible in this series. And this is a continuous enrollment, so you can apply at any time. They're basically spending money until they run out. The license plate series is funded by all of you wonderful people that may have spent a little extra money each year to get one of the conservation license plates. The first of which was that horned lizard plate you see here. That money goes to funding this LIP series, and it's really targeted at high priority species of greatest conservation need. That's SGCNs. Right? These are listed in our state wildlife action plan. And then there's a sub list that are considered high priority for this series in particular. The most well-known of which is probably the monarch butterfly. So if you're doing a project that benefits monarchs, this may be a series where you can get some funding through LIP. And these are selected from watershed series, that first series I talked about, those applicants. So if you submit that pre-proposal and you're not selected for the watershed series, you may, again, if your target fits that conservation license plate series, you may get selected for that other series. So you've got maybe multiple levels that you can get funded, or you might get selected for funding. So what do you do with LIP? This is a list of common things that are done with LIP funding. I can tell you they do try to avoid paying for fencing. That's one thing that Tim Sigma at TPWD pointed out. And not that they haven't, but they're generally not trying to spend money on fencing. But all these other projects are potential LIP projects, and these practices are things that most of these cost share programs are going to help pay for in some manner. So this is a good list in general to think about, from brush management to invasive species control, and even planting, reseeding, or planting native vegetation to benefit those target species. And you can see here on that bottom right picture, that's a woodland brush management project. Looks like they did some understory thinning, most likely for the benefit of golden cheek warbler. So that would be a good example of a LIP project potentially. So I include this picture. This is a LIP project. I put it in here because most of you, all of you have probably seen a pasture that looks like this. Many of you may have pastures that look like this. And so if you're wondering, well, what does a LIP project site look like? This is it. This is one of them. This property is on the Blanco River, and a combination of practices here of brush management, mesquite control. It's fairly low density in this pasture, which is good. Already, but they're going to do some brush management and then some reseeding, range enhancement, planting for pollinators and grassland birds as well as part of their LIP project. Here's the process. In general, I mentioned that pre-proposal stage. That gives them, that's kind of a first flush. They can pick out those that look more interesting, that may fit the criteria better. If your project does, they'll ask for a full proposal, which is a little more involved. Then you get to go through, if you're selected, you get to go through all the paperwork and contracting and all that. There is a fair amount of paperwork involved with this. This is federal money, so as you can imagine, there's no shortage of things to fill out and sign. It's not overwhelming, and Parks and Wildlife is there. They want to spend this money. They're there to help you through that process, of course. So that takes a little bit of time. And then typically by about October of the year, sometime around now, they'd be announcing awarding contracts. And then you get a year or a few years to do the work. Then once that work's complete and verified, that's when you get paid. They're not going to give you money up front to do these projects. They're going to reimburse you for costs. And so once it's done, then you could submit an invoice, and the comptroller cuts you a check. And what's important to note is that this can be done in phases. So if you've got a multi-phase project like brush management followed by reseeding, you could get paid on the completion of a phase. So you do the brush management first, and then you would submit that, verify that work, submit that invoice and get paid for that. And then later, once you've completed the reseeding, you can get reimbursed for that portion of the project. So it's not, it doesn't have to wait until the entire project is complete in all cases. So on to PUB. I like this program a lot, mainly because it's a little easier to manage. It's a little less bureaucratic to deal with, a little less paperwork. It's still federal dollars funneling through Parks and Wildlife, so there's still some to deal with, but a little easier, a little simpler. You can apply at any time for PUB. And this is very targeted. It's focused on grassland restoration in non-native pastures. So this isn't going to pay for brush management or some of those other things that I listed under LIP. This is very specific to controlling exotic grasses, non-native grasses, and replanting with native plants. That's what this program's for. Originally started with Bermuda grass pastures kind of east of 35, focused on quail and other grassland birds. It's been expanded in the last several years to include much more of the state and focus on things like King Ranch bluestem, which is probably a more common issue for many of you. PUB does have a minimum project size, unlike LIP. You've got to have at least 25 acres. But I have successfully used multiple sites on an individual property to meet that 25-acre requirement. So if you may not have 25 contiguous acres for a project, you may have, say, 3 10-acre sections on your property that might be suitable for this. That might be possible to tie those together and consolidate under one project to meet that 25-acre minimum. So just because you have some scattered small projects, don't think that you're automatically excluded. This program, the reason it's a little simpler is Parks and Wildlife's just giving you supplies. They're going to hand you the herbicide. They're going to hand you the seeds for reseeding based on an approved seed mix. You and your biologists get to adjust that for your site, what's going to work best. But they've got a list of approved plants. They're going to hand you those seeds, and sometimes, if it's available, you can use one of the no-till drills that Parks and Wildlife might have. I wouldn't count on that, just it's often occupied, so I'd suggest if you're doing this, you find a contractor that can do rangeland drilling without having to worry about that, borrowing that drill. But if you're doing it on your own, you've got your own equipment, don't mind drilling, you might have access to one of Parks and Wildlife's. You provide the equipment and the labor, and you do it yourself, or you hire a contractor to implement, to do the spraying, to do the reseeding. There's no cash exchange. They're giving you the supplies, you're doing the work. That's how the program works. And it really does. It ends up, and the projects I've done, it ends up covering about half the cost, at least. Half the cost. If you're doing the work on your own, it may cover more than half the cost for you. So again, ends up about 50% cost share at the end of the day because of the expense of herbicide and that seed mix. This is the focal area for PUB. Imagine it covers most of you if you're in one of those colored counties, then you're eligible to apply for PUB. And there's a couple of different funding levels. That's the color difference. Not worth getting into today, but if you're in any of those colored counties, you might be eligible for PUB. Again, you've got to have a pasture that's suitable for spraying and reseeding and is dominated by non-native grasses in order to qualify for a project like this. This is an example of a PUB project that we helped a landowner with. This was a fairly clean Bermuda grass hay pasture that this goes left to right and then top to bottom in time. You can see the dates on here. When we started, that June 21st, 2017 is after obviously a spraying. We got really good kill. They're not 100%. Bermuda grass is pretty tough stuff. You can see that little patch of green. We ended up spraying this field 3 times total, twice in the growing season and then once in the cool season to knock back some of the cool season grasses and reduce competition for the warm season plants we were going to plant. You can see by August of the next year, about a year later, and this was a very dry year. 2018 was pretty dry. That first growing season was a pretty rough one for this project, but we still got a really good response, especially considering the dry conditions. You can see there in that August 21st, 2018 photo, we got lots of, they're small, but we got lots of native grasses coming up, native bunch grasses popping up in there. And that's normal. These things take time. The saying goes, the first year they sleep, second year they creep, third year they leap. And that's what we're seeing now. If you jump to that July 7th, 2020, that's this summer. This pasture looks very different, very diverse. Lots of native warm season grasses, big and little blue stem, switchgrass, Indian grass in abundance, American basket flower, and lots of cool season wildflowers as well. So been a really strong success. We've been blessed with some good rains over the course of these 3 years, and it's responded really well. And landowners seeing lots of additional use by the wild turkey in the area, songbirds, deer heavily using this pasture. There's lots of fawning and bedding areas in this pasture now. Been a real success. So that's kind of what a PUB project can look like and the timeline you should expect for results. I'm going to mention these last few really briefly, mainly just so you know their names, you know they exist. The GRIP program, Grassland Restoration Incentives Program, this is through the Oaks and Prairies joint venture. You can see the target area here in the map on the right. That yellow area is the focal area. If you're in that yellow area, you could be eligible, but they are really focused on those green outlined counties. So those are going to get highest priority for this program. But just because you're not in one, if you're in that yellow area, you still might qualify for the GRIP program. These are direct payments for grassland habitat improvement, things like prescribed grazing, prescribed burning, brush management, reseeding, a lot of the things we've already talked about. This one, again, is based on the NRCS reimbursement rates. That's how they decide how much money they're going to pay you. It's also got a minimum project size of 25 acres. And a 5-year maintenance period. That's what they expect out of you. I didn't mention under LIP and PUB as well. Those are typically 10-year contracts. And what that means effectively is don't destroy it. Don't undo everything you did in the next 10 years. It doesn't mean that if it's not successful that you have to give the money back or pay back what you got. It just means don't go in there after 5 years later, do a PUB program. Don't go in there and plow it back up and respread Bermuda grass. Don't do that. For GRIP, anybody can apply, but these go through the NRCS process. You're going to be dealing with NRCS when you're talking about GRIP and the Oak Prairies and Joint Ventures folks. CRP, for those of you who might have cropland, this is one of our oldest and most beneficial programs for those of you who fit that bill. Lots and lots of different practices that can be funded here. but the land generally is going to need a cropping history. So for the last 6 years, typically it needs to have been planted in crops. So you can't have an old cropland that hasn't been planted in 10 years and try to claim CRP. CRP is about renting that land from you to benefit wildlife habitat and conservation rather than having it be in crop production. Ideally on marginal croplands or croplands that aren't as productive for you, this can be a good program. So you can't take stuff that's not being cropped and try to get paid not to crop it. So there are a few practices, that apply to marginal pasture land where it doesn't have to have a cropping history. The most applicable for most of you is probably going to be riparian buffers. It's CP22. That's for protecting and enhancing riparian areas. And again, those areas don't have to have a crop history necessarily, nor does the land around it to qualify for that program. CRP is a rental program, so they're not just necessarily paying you to do the practices, they're renting the land from you so that you don't grow crops or graze it in the case of marginal pasture lands. There's up to a 90% cost payment, incentive payments, sign-up bonuses, lots of potential money here. So this can be a very beneficial program if you qualify for CRP. This is part of the Farm Bill. If you're familiar with any of these programs, it's probably EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program. This one is common. If I run into a landowner that's used a cost share program, it's usually EQIP. And in the Edwards Plateau, it's usually for something like brush management, ash juniper control, things like that. This is generally targeted at agricultural producers, livestock owners. It's not exclusive. If you're not a producer, you should still, if you're interested, talk to NRCS about this program. They've got some leeway locally to put money into projects, even if it's not exclusively for a production operation. This is going to cover things again like brush management, plantings. I've got a landowner in Comal who's used EQIP for cross fencing to facilitate rotational grazing and infrastructure development in the form of additional water sources for livestock to facilitate rotational grazing. They've also used it for brush management and for reseeding on that property. So they've used it for a lot of different projects and have seen a lot of benefits from the EQIP program. Both CRP and EQIP require you to register with the Farm Services Agency, FSA. You can find your local service center at that website. You can also just Google USDA Service Center and you'll find a website with a map to get down to your local office. That's the place to start. You'll have to register with FSA if you're not already, you don't have an account with them. And then you'd work with NRCS to see which programs might fit. Again, there's a lot of them, which is why I'm not going into a lot of detail on those here. And so they're going to match you up with the best potential programs for your property and for your conservation goals. So that's all I've got. I'm happy to take questions if we've got time, or we can do that in the panel. You know what you want to do, Daniel?
I think we've got at least one question. Tiffany, I'll let you take it from here.
Yep, I believe we have two. The first is from Janet. What was the herbicide that was used in your pub examples of reseeding to native grasses to remove the existing?
Right, so good question. So the goal there is, again, you're dealing with non-native grasses, so it's to basically start with a clean slate. So what you're going to be using is glyphosate, brand name Roundup. You're going to spray it, you're going to kill everything. And because of that, you're really looking to start with a pasture that's at least 50% non-native. So if you've got a lot of natives already in your pasture and maybe some King Ranch Blue Stem mixed in, that's not necessarily a good pub project. But if those non-native grasses dominate, the idea is you go in, you kill everything, and you start with as clean a slate as possible and reseed on top of that. You won't kill everything. There's that project. There is still some Bermuda grass out there. It's really hard to eliminate, but it's scattered and the site is much more diverse and dominated by natives now instead of that coastal.
And we do have another question. Are the EQIP programs available to people who don't qualify for limited resource farmer rancher?
I don't know the answer to that. Maybe somebody else does. There is a lot of those EQIPs got an income requirement. It's pretty high. I don't recall offhand what it is, but there is a maximum income requirement that pretty much everybody I know is well below that income requirement. So there is that. That's something that FSA and NRCS would walk you through, but I can't answer that question specifically. Maybe somebody else can.
Shane, yeah, this is Steve Nelle. I can answer that. Yes, EQIP is eligible. You do not have to be a limited resource producer in order to sign up for EQIP. Although, if you are a limited resource producer, minority, or a beginning farmer and rancher, you get higher payment rates. You get considerably higher payment rates, but it's not a requirement for the program.
Thank you, Steve.
Any more questions? We have time for one more for Shane. All right. Well, Shane, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. That was
my pleasure.
Amazing how you packaged all those acronyms and opportunities into 30 minutes. We really do appreciate it. All right, everybody. We are now going to transition into the final session of this morning's workshop, which is our landowner panel. We have two landowners who have volunteered their time with us today. The first is Errol Candy, and the second is Howard Hicks. These are two folks who are really invested in their land stewardship ethic, taking care of the land now and for the future. And so I'd like to, if both of you could take yourselves off of mute, I would love to start out just by asking each of you, and we'll start with Errol, to tell us a bit about yourself and your families and what inspired y'all to start looking at conservation easements.
Okay, I'll try to be as brief as possible. I think our story, my wife Susan and I, is very similar to many other landowners who donated easements. Way back in 1998, we bought 175 acres in southwest Gillespie County, and we noticed it had been overgrazed for many years, like a lot of properties, but there wasn't much we could do about it at the time. And then Susan read about wildlife tax valuation. And so in 2003, we actually converted to that, which meant we didn't have to put cattle on every year. And that made a huge difference with actually native grasses coming back. And we didn't just have a monoculture of KR blue stem. So that was the first, first step was buying the property. Second step was actually going to a wildlife valuation. It's nice to be able to manage it that way and not have to put grazing animals on every year. Then the third step, which was the most important step, is that Susan was reading about conservation easements in a Nature Conservancy publication. And we started investigating that, and we looked at different land trusts and decided to go with the Hill Country Land Trust in 2008. So it was a three-stage decision, really. And we were doing everything really that we were going to do with the conservation easement anyway. So it wasn't for us a difficult decision. We have no children. So the big scare was, for us, was, you know, we put all this work and effort in planting diverse trees and shrubs and thinning out the cedar. We don't believe cedar's all bad. So we've thinned it out, and we were doing all that, and we had nobody to leave it to. And we knew what would happen, because all around us, even though we're far southwest of the county, all the development is going on around here now, and all the properties are being subdivided. So it was really for open space that we donated the easement, which was perfectly acceptable to the land trust. We actually afterwards found a rock midden and some arrowheads, so that was a nice surprise. The other thing that I was very pleased about, and so was Susan, is that with the land trust visits, you learn so much from the people on the board. They are experts in many different fields, And although we've done our homework, they have helped us so much in understanding how to continue doing what we're doing and how to improve it. So those land trust visits were invaluable. As I said, we didn't really do it for the financial reasons, but you never look a gift horse in their mouth. So that was quite nice to get the financial benefits. I would also like to thank the Land Trust from its origins. We started with our easement fairly soon after the Land Trust was formed, and we watched it develop to a very, very good organization. And I'd like to thank all the original founder members and all the people who've been on the boards since then, and specifically the board that's there now, because they are almost all full-time and they give up their time to just do the land trust work, which is, I find, rather amazing. I don't think I could have done it when I was working. So a big thank you to all the previous members and current members of the Hill Country Land Trust. The transfer to the Land Conservancy, Texas Land Conservancy, is a very good one, I believe, because I'm actually on the board now and I've seen all the hard work that's gone in by both organizations, and I'm very, very comfortable with the future and our future, and particularly the financial future of TLC. So basically, I think that's about it in a nutshell. No regrets. I'll probably pass before my wife because I was a bit of a cradle snatcher and she's younger than me. So I think I will be probably the first to go, but when she goes, at least she'll know that our property will be in good hands. We won't have subdivisions, and hopefully the people who inherit it or buy it will actually continue with our legacy. And thank you very much for your time.
Harold, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. I've got a few questions to ask both of you, but first I'd like to hear from Mr. Hicks. Mr. Hicks, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your family? What was your journey like in terms of starting to look into conservation easements for your place?
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I grew up in Bandera County, and I think back to the 60s, the 1960s, 1970s, we started seeing subdivisions go in and the whole county being cut up. It's probably more extensive than a lot of areas because it's close to San Antonio. And I wasn't too happy about that, but didn't think too much about it. And fortunately in my family, that was my dad's family over in Bandera County. Then my mom's family is ranching in the Blanco-Gillespie County line, right on the line there in northern, northeastern Gillespie County. And as we started focusing on that ranching operation, our family, we formed a family partnership. And so we had my children and eventually grandchildren are going to go into it. And we even got great grandchildren now that will be involved. And I got to thinking about what's happening as far as subdivisions, and didn't want it to happen to this land because it's been in the family since the 1850s. So I thought about conservation easements, but I didn't do any serious looking into that. But one of my sons went to some seminars. I guess it was the a Texas group that did those seminars every year. He learned a good bit about it, and he happened to meet Mark Steinbach from Texas Land Conservancy that we're talking about. And Mark gave him a lot more information, and we decided to investigate it more seriously and talked to Mark, and then we started talking to our family. And like I say, it was children and grandchildren, and now there's even great-grandchildren involved. So what we eventually did was we sat everybody down in one room and had Mark visit with us, and we explained exactly what was involved, that this was something that was going to be in perpetuity. But it was certainly our desire, and as it turned out, it was the desire of all of our children and grandchildren to do the same thing too. We never want this place to be cut up. So we started working with Texas Land Conservancy, and eventually it was a small piece of property, about 175 acres, but it was adjacent to family ranch, a partnership that was about 1,400 acres. So we started talking to our cousins, and they were interested in it as well. And about 3 years later, we were able to get that property into a conservation easement as well, were also influenced by one of our neighbors who already had about 225 acres in a conservation easement with TLC. So it was useful to talk to him, his experience and his confidence in that organization. So that's the basic journey to get where we are today.
I have several questions for both Mr. Candy and Mr. Hicks, but I want to encourage all the participants, please do not be shy. This is your opportunity to hear from folks who have gone through this, to hear their firsthand experience. So please don't be shy. Share your questions in the chat box and we'll get those read out. And in the meantime, while y'all are thinking of your questions, I'll ask a couple more. Could y'all tell us a bit about, this process, looking back, you've gone through the whole transaction process. What was a key lesson learned, perhaps an aha moment that you had that you'd like to share with landowners who may be right now considering, is an easement the right fit for me? What would be your key lesson learned that you'd like to impart?
I mentioned it briefly before, Daniel. We started out, we thought we knew our property pretty well. We'd walked it, we'd looked at things, but not being experts in anything in particular, we were trying to learn from a lot of different people. And we did learn that it's best to talk to almost everyone. I've always had the motto, listen to what other people say because they may know more than you do. And I've discovered that's often the case. And with the land trust people who came on visits here, after they did the baseline report, we discovered a whole lot of plants and grasses particularly that we didn't know we had. And then every year that we had a visit, we would discover other things. And our property took on we loved our property, but it took on a different characteristics. For us, it actually became to us even more precious because we realized what we had actually missed by not understanding enough about this type of environment. And with the information that was given to us by the people who did the visits from the Land Trust, I think we were much more appreciative of the property. And it's like trying to explain to people why you love your children. There's no really good words for that. And to try and explain why you love your property is also difficult. It's almost a spiritual thing rather than an explanation thing. So once you've had it, you know what it means. But if you've never had it, you don't know what it means. And that's what's so good about reaching out to the children. So in a nutshell, we've come to appreciate our property much more with the input from the authorities or experts that know about these things, which are actually the site visit land trust personnel. And TLC have permanent visitors who do site visits, and they are very good, according to reports, in what they do, and they can give that advice too. So you develop new projects as you go, and that's what my and my wife have learned, and we've been given new ways to do things too, which have actually saved us time.
Thank you. Mr. Hicks, any key aha moments or lessons learned from the process?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that this is in perpetuity. Sometimes we don't stop and think about that, but this is forever. So it's important that everybody understands that's involved in the transaction, especially when you have family and future family involved. And we were very appreciative of the TLC people. They were very patient with us, answered all our questions, spent a lot of time with us. And so it's important that you do that. I think the other thing that's important is when you decide you want to do a conservation easement, there are many factors that you have to take into account in drawing up that easement. You have to think through all of those things, and it was a lot of work, but it was worth it because, as Errol mentioned, he learned so much more about his place from the baseline survey and those sort of things. We learned a lot as well, but just having to think through all the different aspects of the things that have to go into that easement is a good process to go through, but it is a lot of work and takes a commitment to do it, but it's worthwhile.
Here's a question that I will broaden, not just for conservation easements. We talked a lot earlier. We heard from Steve Nelle about land stewardship. We heard from Shane about the various cost share programs. So just in general, as y'all have been stewarding your lands, is there anything that you wish in hindsight you had known and perhaps you would have done differently that you think folks here might be interested in hearing? Whether it's, again, the stewardship piece, different management techniques, or maybe it's how you approach the conservation easement.
I can maybe talk a little bit about only one thing that we missed probably on the first round, because it was early in the process and everybody was still learning. We did have building envelopes. I'm glad that was brought up. We had one for the barn, which we took advantage of, and we had another one for a relative, perhaps mother-in-law, brother-in-law, and it was a parcel of 2 acres in a part of the property that was far away from the main house. So it was fine. But we ran into an issue when we thought about taking that option, is that the person who built the house, the relative who built the house, wouldn't own the property. And now I think there's a way around that by actually parceling off a piece and not including it in the easement. And we weren't aware of that. So all I would say to people is, if you want to do that and let somebody else in the family build on the parcel, because of legal reasons, you really probably should parcel that off. It's not going to be a big piece, hopefully, and parcel that off and don't include it in the easement. That's the only thing. Otherwise, absolutely no regrets.
Thanks. Mr. Hicks, anything you would have done differently in hindsight?
Not really that I can think of offhand. It was, as I say, TLC was very helpful to, and also the attorneys. We worked with Braun and Gresham as well, and they were very helpful in helping us to think through all the issues. And I haven't heard from any of our family that there's anything that they think we should have done differently either.
Well, Mr. Candy, Mr. Hicks, any parting words for folks who are thinking about conservation easements and starting that journey?
Just do it. If you have any thoughts in that direction, it's worth the effort. It's worth getting the family lined up. As I said, we didn't have to do that, but I know others who have. And the discussion should be had now. People don't put enough in their wills inevitably, and it becomes a total mess at the end. So even if you don't go through the easement, it's worth having the conversation with the family if they're adult children, getting it all organized, getting it in line. And if they're of the same mindset as you are, it's a done deal. But I would say do it. We all believe in it. And why not?
I guess my only comment would be, I wish we had done it sooner. So.
Well, thank you both for joining us this morning and sharing your experience. It's always, I think, one of the most compelling parts of these workshops is to hear directly from folks who have lived and breathed this experience. So thank you so much for sharing with us. We really do appreciate it. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you all have a great weekend. Enjoy this beautiful weather, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you.